Coal dust drifted across the roofs of Cumberland, Kentucky, like black snow the morning Seraphina Wilde turned 9, and the scent of burnt shale mixed with honeysuckle created the strange perfume she would always associate with childhood. Her father, Orion, carried her up the creaking exterior ladder of their duplex as dawn bled into a violet sky, a battered thermos of chicory coffee rattling against his belt. He was a lean, lantern-jawed man whose mining helmet still glimmered with flecks of mica, and in those pre-dawn moments he tried to give his daughter the galaxies he could never reach himself. On the flattest patch of tin roof he unfolded a frayed horse blanket, unrolled a dog-eared atlas of the night sky, and, with a piece of coal the size of a robin's egg, sketched constellations onto the silvery surface. His hands were cracked, nails forever rimmed with soot, yet his lines came out clean and sure, Cygnus in a graceful arch, Cassiopeia like a crooked crown, Perseus with a sword as long as Main Street. Seraphina, still blinking sleep from her eyes, nestled into the crook of his arm and tried to imagine the stars as something solid enough to stand on. While Orion traced the shape of the northern lights, he had read they sometimes reached as far south as Indiana during geomagnetic storms. He made his softer, secret promise. If science could find a way to cool the upper atmosphere just a few degrees, he whispered, Cumberland's children might see a ribbon of green fire dance above the coal tipples, and no one would ever again call their town colorless. Seraphina listened, pulse thrumming to match his excitement, and though she scarcely understood half his words, the certainty in his gravel-rough voice settled into her bones like scripture. Look up, always look up, because safety and wonder both live overhead. Years slid by in the rhythm of mining shifts and school bells. Orion brought home little treasures from the deep tunnels, glinting pyrite cubes, a fossilized fern leaf, a pebble he swore was a fragment of a meteor, gifts that filled a repurposed lunch pail under Seraphina's bed. Her mother, Juniper, kept house and volunteered at the library, smoothing her daughter's hair with fingers that smelled of lemon oil and old paper. She encouraged the rooftop astronomy sessions despite neighbors' gossip that a girl oughtn't spend so many hours in the night air. Better starlight than the glare of TV, Juniper said, and pinned a glow-in-the-dark mobile of the solar system above the kitchen table so their breakfasts felt like briefings for interplanetary travel. On a muggy July afternoon, the mine sirens wailed an unbroken note that emptied every porch on Magnolia Avenue. An unexpected cave-in on the second level, they said later, a cascade of shale no engineer had predicted. Orion's crew surfaced in tatters, save for 3 men who did not return. Among the missing was the one who carried galaxies in chalk lines on his daughter's roof. The funeral was quick, the settlement modest, the grief cavernous. When the pastor finished Psalm 147, he heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds, Seraphina pressed a hand to the brass nameplate on the coffin and felt its chill through her gloves. In the silence that followed the final hymn, she imagined her father's last instruction echoed through the shaft, keep your eyes open, child, stone is heavy, but the sky cannot fall on you. Loss hardened into propulsion. Seraphina studied under flickering fluorescent lights at Cumberland High, then under brighter halogens at a satellite campus of the University of Kentucky, where she devoured every elective on astrophysics and cryogenic materials science. Scholarships covered most tuition, but there were months she sold homemade star charts at the county fair to afford lab fees. Letters of recommendation, one from a retired NASA engineer who discovered her tinkering with liquid nitrogen dewars at a science expo, lifted her to Columbia University for senior research. New York felt impossibly vertical, buildings sharpening the sky into slivers, yet she carried her father's mantra like a pocket compass, look up, look up. Graduation brought honors and debt in equal measure. She dreamed of pursuing a doctorate in exoplanet climatology, but fellowship panels preferred candidates with pristine resumes, not applicants who moonlighted at diners to wire money home. Rejection letters piled up beside overdue electric bills, and the final blow arrived on thick embossed paper that began, "We regret to inform you." To survive, she took the night shift at Melted Nebula Café, a narrow midtown storefront painted a shade of indigo that vanished after sunset. There, amid the hiss of espresso steam and the clatter of chipped saucers, Seraphina practiced mental calculus on napkins, escape velocity equations, partial pressure differentials, a half-formed idea for orbital microlabs that could preserve endangered DNA in near-absolute zero pods. Late one sleet-slick Tuesday, a customer stepped inside carrying a cane of gunmetal titanium capped by an obsidian sphere. He wore no overcoat despite the biting wind, only a charcoal three-piece suit tailored so precisely it looked aerodynamically engineered. His features were striking, pale hair combed back with surgical accuracy, eyes the muted green of deep-sea glass, cheekbones suggesting equal parts hunger and command. While he waited for his Americano, he studied the chalkboard menu as though scanning star charts. The name he offered at the register, Balthazar Crane, echoed around Serafina's mind like a warning klaxon and a prayer at once. Crane Nebula Corporation, the private aerospace titan, had dominated science headlines since she was 13. When her hands trembled, a few drops of coffee spattered the cane's obsidian knob, and she blurted an apology. He regarded the stain, then her, and in a voice pitched low enough to steady earthquake faults said, "No need to worry, Ms. Wilde. Obsidian understands fire." She froze, confused that he knew her surname without checking the receipt, until she noticed his gaze settle on her ID badge, half hidden by a lock of hair. Embarrassment flared, but curiosity burned brighter. What executive of a multi-billion-dollar firm spent midnight hours in a humble cafe not 5 blocks from his glass spire of a headquarters? Balthazar paid, tucked $2 into the tip jar, and before leaving set a business card on the counter, black matte, letters embossed in iridescent silver that shifted in cafe light. He tapped the edge twice, a gesture somewhere between punctuation and invitation. "Your formula on the napkin," he said, nodding toward the scribble of delta V calculations beside the register, "would reduce fuel mass by 14% if you compensate for thermal bleed. I assume you wrote it. Meet me at my tower tomorrow at 8. Bring that idea." Then he was through the door and into the sleet, a phantom among neon halos. Serafina stood motionless while the cafe's wall clock ticked from 12:07 to 12:08 a.m. She touched the matte card and felt a static spark snap her finger, as if the universe itself approved of audacity. Somewhere above the clouds, winter constellations marched westward in silent procession, and she realized her father had been right all along. Safety and wonder did coexist overhead, but sometimes they descended in the shape of an obsidian-topped cane and an impossible offer that smelled faintly of chicory and stars. The dawn that followed did not feel like ordinary morning light so much as the hush just before launch, and Serafina's heartbeat kept time with the subway's iron wheels as they rattled north beneath Manhattan toward 47th Street. She had slept scarcely an hour, yet her mind simmered with calculations on the back of a deli receipt, half in ink, half in memory. These numbers, she told herself, might decide whether she rose beyond the ceiling of every small-town statistic or settled forever into the drift of forgotten talent. Stepping onto the pavement, she found the air brittle with winter charcoal and exhaust, and directly ahead the headquarters of Crane Nebula Corporation thrust skyward like a shard of midnight glass, its edges catching sunrise in copper and rose. A waterfall of warm air greeted her inside the revolving door, along with a lobby so cavernous it felt telescopic, terrazzo floor dotted with fiber-optic constellations, walls upholstered in liquid crystal that rippled with satellite telemetry, reception stations staffed by attendants whose charcoal uniforms matched the exterior stone. Each visitor badge projected a brief hologram of its bearer's resume, so when Serafina presented her driver's license the security panel flared with data she had not provided: Columbia Honors, Cryomaterials Thesis, the National Undergraduate Astrophysics Award, evidence that someone upstairs had already threaded her life into the building's nervous system. She followed a rib of carbon fiber escalators toward the elevator banks, the soles of her discount heels whispering across resin floors, until a woman with platinum buzz-cut hair intercepted her and murmured that Mr. Crane prefers the express lift. The doors slid apart without a button press, and Serafina entered a chamber paneled in matte obsidian, hexagonally faceted like the interior of a stealth drone. A single strip of amber light traced the seam where walls met ceiling, and moments after the doors sealed, the car accelerated so smoothly she felt only a soft pressure at her ankles, as though the building decided to skim gravity's surface rather than climb through it. Midway up, the lighting shifted to auroral greens and blues and then deepened into twilight violet. She realized the cabin was syncing its palette to the altitude's changing spectral scatter, turning a mundane ascent into a time-lapse of sunrise. When the numbers above the door touched 63, the car sighed to a halt, and the same doors opened onto a corridor that looked nothing like a corporate suite and everything like the quiet deck of a research starship: polished basalt floor, indirect lighting, no sound but the hush of recirculated air. Balthazar Crane waited in the threshold of a vast, lens-shaped conference chamber whose walls were a single uninterrupted window on the city. Without greeting, he gestured her toward a floating semicircle of glass that served as table and interface, the surface alive with slow-turning orbital models. He asked if she drank coffee. She said she had exceeded her quota for the century. He smiled in a way that made the skyline seem to bend imperceptibly. Then, with the same abruptness he had shown in the café, he posed a question: how many allowable electronic transitions exist within the Balmer series before thermal noise at 3 Kelvin drowns the signal entirely? The query landed like an anvil wrapped in silk, yet adrenaline steadied her tongue. She traced invisible calculations across the tabletop's holographic keyboard, spoke of photon mean free paths, referenced Stark broadening and Rydberg corrections, and concluded that at 3 Kelvin the only transitions remotely detectable would be those producing wavelengths longer than 650 nanometers, effectively collapsing the visible output to a crimson ghost. When she finished, Crane nodded once, as though merely confirming weather conditions, and then pivoted the conversation to her napkin formula. He expanded the model until the room darkened and they stood inside a virtual shell of low Earth orbit trajectories, each path an illuminated thread. Your equation, he said, opens an extra payload margin of 14.3% if cryogenic boil-off is captured and recompressed rather than vented. What could you fly with that? She swallowed, answered that you could loft entire biorepositories, freeze them below 1 Kelvin, archive genetic lineages before climate erosion erased them. You could, in effect, bottle evolution against extinction. He slid a blank tablet across the table, stylus balanced atop, and told her to write her name if she wished to direct an experimental division for 6 months, no ledgered salary yet, no ceiling on resources, total authority over a project called Aurora Arc whose success must be absolute because failure would cost not stock value but living species. There would be no formal contract until legal structures caught up, only his word and her signature, and she could refuse and keep her safe anonymity behind espresso machines. Her pulse hammered like piledrivers in her ears, yet she felt her father's cold-drawn constellations burn behind her eyelids. Without a tremor she wrote S, wild and looping characters that confirmed fateful consent. Crane pressed his thumbprint beside the ink and added a tiny gravitational sigil, a stylized spiral galaxy that served as his personal cipher, then switched off the interface, plunging the room back into morning daylight. Their walk to the research floor resembled a descent into some mythic forge of intellect. They passed through a corridor lined with vacuum-sealed glass cases, each containing an artifact of scientific audacity: a singed pressure glove from an Apollo extravehicular suit, a bent titanium strut recovered from a failed Mars lander, a quartz ampoule filled with aerogel that had once captured comet dust. At the door labeled Cryogenic Systems, Quillen Park met them, leaning on a chromium exoskeleton that enhanced his withered left leg. His expression mixed curiosity with a welder's skepticism. Crane introduced Serafina as the new lead architect of Aurora Arc, then vanished down a side passage without ceremony, leaving her in a silence scented faintly of liquid helium. Quillen motioned to a mezzanine window overlooking a chamber where technicians in graphite-gray suits guided robotic arms around a sphere the size of a city bus, its surface studded with microthruster nozzles and sensor arrays. Prototype 0, he said, his baritone scratched by old injuries, built on a budget that already hemorrhages zeros. Mr. Crane claims you can rewrite the thermal math. If those equations fail at altitude, every DNA strand inside crystallizes into useless glass and we may as well torch dollar bills for warmth. Serafina studied the prototype, noted frost blooming at gasket seams, glimpsed the flicker of superconductor coils chasing each other like phantom fireflies beneath the outer shell, and she allowed herself a single breath of vertigo before answering that the design was clever but lacked a dynamic bleed shunt. Without it, the cryostat's inner layers would supercool unevenly and fracture. Quillen's eyebrow arched, skepticism sharpening to intrigue, and he began peppering her with calculations so rapid they felt like hail on steel. She held ground, countered with latent heat tables and predicted phase shifts in exotic alloys, until at last he grunted a short laugh and keyed open the mezzanine security door. A blast of air, bitterly cold and fragrant with fluoropolymers, swept over them as they stepped onto the fabrication floor where Aurora Arc waited, moon-pale under floodlamps. The technicians paused to glance at the newcomer with ink still drying on her tablet signature, and in their eyes she saw reflections of her own mixture of dread and awe. By the time the shift klaxon signaled midday break, Serafina was already wrist-deep in schematics, her badge replaced by a temporary tag reading Principal Cryologist, and Quillen Park had volunteered the access codes she would need long after midnight. While the city's 6 stories below pulsed with traffic and sirens, the two of them sketched and argued and revised, solder smoke drifting like incense through the bays. Unknown to Serafina, corporate auditors whispered about improvised authority and unvetted personnel, yet Balthazar Crane sat in his private observatory atop the same tower, sifting the telemetry of high-latitude sky glow and smiling at each microflare that crossed his screens, convinced that he had just ignited something rarer than trust and more volatile than rocket propellant, an alliance between hunger and vision that, if nourished, might indeed refrigerate the heavens long enough to save. What crawled and bloomed beneath them, steel shutters retracted with a sigh that reminded Serafina of midnight tide, revealing the heart of the cryogenic bay and the intimidating symmetry of Prototype Zero. The craft dominated the hangar like a captive moon, its matte silver panels ribbed with capillaries of bright copper that pulsed under inspection lamps. Bundles of cables thick as a python spiraled from a temporary power spine into the satellite's core, and every few seconds one of the coils gave a tired groan as liquid helium coursed through diagnostics. Engineers drifted around it in magnetized boots, their gestures precise but wary, as though worshipping a god whose mood might switch without warning. From a high catwalk Quillen Park watched the choreography, shoulders squared inside the chromium exoskeleton that supported his war-torn leg. His face bore the calm of someone who had already survived worse than professional embarrassment, yet the hard line of his mouth telegraphed a verdict not yet spoken. Serafina climbed to him, a tablet under one arm, the other hand clamping a mug of stale coffee she had rescued from the brake station. She tried to still the tremor in her wrist. 46 hours of near-continuous work had left her blood fizzing with caffeine and half-processed adrenaline. Beneath them the hull temperature readouts glimmered amber, then red, then slid back to yellow, a restless strobing that told her the craft's thermal equilibrium was a lie waiting to break. She showed Quillen a plot of microfracture propagation logged during the last cooldown cycle. Hairline fissures bloomed like frost flowers wherever the copper traces met the palladium joints, and each time the coolant pump kicked above 60% flow, the fractures elongated by 30 microns. "We're fighting two enemies," she said, voice hoarse. Capillary action in the copper draws in helium, flash freezing and expanding. Then differential contraction rips the bond line. We patch one fracture and another springs up further along the circuit. Quillen's fingers tapped the rail in a staccato rhythm, metal glove rasping over metal baluster. Copper was picked for conductivity and cost, he reminded her, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone cataloging an autopsy. Palladium is elegant on paper, horrific on procurement. We'd murder the budget. She rotated her tablet so he could see the new alloy spec she had devised, 35% palladium, 60 nickel, 5 rhenium, vapor deposited in a fine lattice only where the thermal stress peaked. "We don't plate the entire network," she said, fighting to keep the plea from her voice. "Only the shoulders of the bends and the flange intersections. The lattice flexes at cryo temps and absorbs the expansion instead of transferring it. We cut helium loss by 18%, potentially bump payload capacity by another 4%. Cost rises, but so does reliability." Quillen studied the model silently, zoomed into the mesh until individual grains resolved like a field of microscopic stars. At last he exhaled through his teeth, the sound more hiss than sigh. "We'd need a 90-minute window with the chamber offline," he said, "and a sputter coater that can handle palladium without contaminating the nickel crucibles." She had anticipated the objection. While most of the team broke for a pre-dawn meal the night before, she had emailed 2 suppliers in Osaka and 1 in Eindhoven. One had already replied, a portable, cleanroom-rated coder aboard a cargo flight scheduled to land at JFK that evening, available for emergency lease if Crane Nebula covered insurance up front. She showed Quillen the correspondence. His eyebrows lifted by a millimeter, a seismic event for a man whose facial muscles rarely shifted. "You've been here 4 days," he said, brushing a fingertip over the screen, "and you're already signing our purchase orders." "Not signing," she corrected. "Just preparing. Mr. Crane said I could rewrite the thermal math." "This is the math." The phrase echoed back to her with an unintended steel, and a moment's fear struck that she had overstepped. But Quillen only scratched his jaw, where a fine white scar traced from cheekbone to ear, legacy of a lab explosion years earlier. "All right, Wild," he said. "Let's see if math can beat Kappa's stubborn nature." Down on the fabrication floor they assembled a skeleton crew: Kamala, chief welder with arms sleeved in neon circuit tattoos, Jethro, systems tech whose quiet humming seemed to soothe machines, and Yulia, a thermal modeler whose laptop wallpaper perpetually displayed a Siberian blizzard, perhaps to remind colleagues what real cold truly meant. The main cryo pump was shut, frost clouds curling away as helium pressure bled to safe levels. Quillen's exoskeleton clicked each time he descended a rung on the maintenance ladder, the sound oddly comforting amid the hiss of vacuum vents purging moisture. Serafina threaded herself into a gap beneath the satellite's belly where a service hatch gaped like a surgically exposed heart valve. The copper traces lay revealed, beautiful, lethal veins glimmering with beads of condensed nitrogen. Guided by Yulia's infrared feed, she marked fracture zones with UV ink until the network resembled a web of luminous scars. Kamala followed, wielding a microdremel that buzzed like an angry wasp, etching shallow channels where the alloy would seat. Each time sparks sizzled against her glove, Serafina's chest tightened, remembering how easily molten copper could leap and weld itself to skin. She forced breath past the memory, focused on the pattern, on every micron of tolerance, on her father's voice that insisted a steady hand turned danger into design. When at last the portable sputter coder arrived, 2 hours late thanks to customs but still intact, Jethro drove a scissor lift beneath the satellite. The machine looked ungainly, a barrel of polished steel festooned with vacuum hoses and warning labels in 4 languages, yet once powered it began to hum at a note just above hearing, a promise of subatomic precision. Serafina loaded palladium-nickel targets and initiated the chamber cycle. Ionized argon danced neon blue through the viewport, stripping atoms from the target and sending them in a fine mist that condensed on the etched channels. 90 minutes stretched into 105 as she ran extra passes over the knuckle joints, unwilling to leave any margin for crack propagation. Quillen said nothing, only leaned on his exoskeleton's cane, eyes narrowed, observing her technique as though recording its motion to memory. When deposition ended, Yulia's scanners showed the alloy film adhered without voids. Kamala fused junctions with a laser welder, sealing the network into a continuous skin. The crew evacuated, and Jethro initiated a slow chill. Helium trickled back until thermometer needles slid toward absolute zero. Everyone gathered around the console, fatigue weighing like sandbags yet minds too sharp with anticipation to surrender to it. The readouts crossed the critical 60% flow where fractures had erupted before. Nothing happened. They nudged to 70, to 75. The hull temperature gradient stabilized within 2 degrees, green bars rising like triumphant banners. Serafina released a breath that quaked her ribcage. Quillen's lips twitched. For a heartbeat she thought he would produce a smile, but what emerged was an approving grunt more eloquent than applause. He dismissed the others to rest, then turned to her as the hangar lights dimmed into energy-saving dusk. "I doubted you," he said, voice low, not quite apology and yet heavier than confession. "Copper is loyal, I forgot everybody outgrows what they rely on if they want to survive orbit." He flexed the gleaming fingers of his exoskeleton, joints whispering. "People, too." She started to offer a protest, but he silenced it with a slight shake of his head. "You gave the Ark room to breathe," he continued. Mr. Crane values victories that rise from calculated rebellion. He'll want to see tonight's logs. He gestured toward a tablet she had left on a tool cart. Put your name on the procedure. Revisions stay credited to originator in this house. Long after Quillen limped away toward the administrative lifts, Seraphina remained in the hush of the bay, the floor reflecting crescent pools of light from maintenance lamps. Beneath the satellite's polished flank she could see her own faint reflection, sleeves streaked with alloy dust, eyes bruised with exhaustion yet alight with something fiercer than triumph. In that mirrored ghost she imagined Orion Wilde standing beside her, coal stick in hand, sketching new constellations on curvature of palladium. She whispered thank you to an empty hangar that felt impossibly immense and, for the first time since signing her name on Crane's tablet, allowed the magnitude of what she had altered to fully strike her. Somewhere between copper and palladium she had crossed a quiet event horizon, leaving behind the orbit of caution for whatever wild gravity lay ahead. The winter night that birthed the fire began with deceptive calm, a hush of snow skimming the midtown glass and the low-frequency hum of backup generators settling into their usual nocturnal tempo. Seraphina had labored through 2 consecutive shifts in the cryogenic bay, shepherding Prototype Zero through a final stress test cycle, when Quillen urged her, half order, half mercy, to steal 2 hours of rest. She rode the freight elevator alone, forehead pressed against the cool alloy wall, and tried to ignore the jitter of residual caffeine in her bloodstream. Somewhere between the 42nd and 40th floors the cab shuddered, lights flickered from daylight white to chemical green, and the emergency brakes clamped with a jolt that rattled her molars. At first she assumed a routine power fluctuation, yet the air that seeped through the grille tasted scorched, metallic, and faintly sweet, the unmistakable signature of burning insulation. An alarm klaxon began to pulse 3 floors above, slow at first, then crescendoing into a war drum staccato that made the steel panels vibrate beneath her palms. Through the half-open inner doors she glimpsed a slice of service corridor lit by red strobes. Smoke coiled there, thin, bluish ribbons at knee level already thickening into graphite clouds. Her first instinct was to force the doors and crawl for the stairwell, but a second impulse overrode it. The server farm for Aurora Ark's design archives occupied the 33rd floor, 2 stories down, exactly along the path of the rising smoke. Every telemetry log, alloy stress graph, and thermal gradient simulation they had painstakingly iterated over the past month was stored on those drives. If the suppression system failed, the intellectual DNA of the mission would incinerate alongside the electronics, leaving the prototype a lifeless husk. She cursed the reflex that turned her toward danger, then jammed her fingers into the emergency override. Sparks spit as she short-bridged contacts with a coin, prying the doors just wide enough to slip through. The corridor air was oven-hot, scented with melting polyethylene and something acrid she recognized as vaporized flux from burnt circuit boards. She tore a sleeve from her lab coat, soaked it in the condensation tray of a nearby HVAC unit, and tied the cloth across her nose and mouth before sprinting toward the stairwell. On the landing above she nearly collided with Balthazar Crane, descending at a measured but urgent pace, suit jacket abandoned, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a small fire extinguisher dangling by the handle and dripping foam. His eyes widened at the sight of her, more in surprise than relief. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" he demanded, voice roughened by smoke. She told him the drives were in jeopardy. Without pausing he thrust the extinguisher into her hands, seized a second cylinder from the wall bracket, and barked that the halon flood had mistimed, leaving the core racks exposed to an electrical inferno. Together they plunged down 2 flights, boots slipping on ash-slick treads. The server room doors gaped like a furnace mouth, hot draft roaring out with enough force to flutter their clothes. Inside, row upon row of blade servers glittered cherry red behind cracked plexiglass, coolant lines ruptured and geysering steam. Overhead sprinklers sputtered uselessly, their nozzles clotted with molten plastic. They attacked the nearest rack first, Seraphina depressing the lever until white foam belched over motherboard sockets while Balthazar strafed the base with a CO2 blast that howled like winter wind. She could feel the heat licking her shins through fire-retardant fabric, hair at her temples crisped despite the soaked mask. Between coughing fits she shouted above the roar that the critical drives were mirrored to rack E5, further in. Crane nodded once, eyes watering but fixed, and motioned her to stay low as they advanced. The aisle resembled a war trench, cables draped in viscous loops, sparks cascading like tracer rounds. Twice she lost sight of him in the smoke, heart pounding at the thought of inhalation collapse, but each time his outline re-emerged, silver hair gone charcoal gray with soot yet posture unbowed. At rack E5 he smashed the housing with a pry bar scavenged from maintenance, yanked the first hot swap module free, and shoved it into her gloved hands. She cradled it like an organ donation, fingers blistering even through the insulation. 5 modules later he barked that the rest were redundant shells already mirrored off-site, time to evacuate before the ceiling trusses softened. A keening groan rolled overhead, the steel superstructure protesting thermal abuse. They ducked as fluorescent fixtures rained shards, dashing for the emergency stairwell with 15 kilograms of data hugging their chests. The corridor beyond had become a wind tunnel, negative pressure from rooftop exhaust fans now reversed and funneling smoke downward, visibility nil. Somewhere a compressor exploded, concussive force buffeting them against cinder block. Crane shoved her ahead, yelling for her to count steps, keep right hand on rail, 42 treads to the next landing. She obeyed mechanically, lungs searing, saliva evaporated into dust. An eternity later, though the exit log would record only 90 seconds, they burst onto a mezzanine where the suppression system had finally kicked, releasing dense halon that pooled around their ankles like cold fog. Sprinklers here worked, water hammered their hair and shoulders, cooling burnt fabric into clammy second skins. Security responders accelerated toward them in hazmat hoods, shouting orders drowned by alarms. Balthazar ignored them, guiding Serafina to a service lift unaffected by the main power drop, pressing the down button with knuckles scraped raw. In the relative quiet of the descending car they leaned against opposite walls, exchanging the stunned half-laugh that sometimes follows unplanned survival. Her limbs shook uncontrollably, adrenaline ebbing left muscles hollow as paper. Crane regarded the drives clutched to her chest, reached across, and steadied them with one soot-smeared hand. "You just saved $6 billion in R&D, he said, voice barely above a whisper. She corrected him, without Quillen's lattice alloy the prototype would still fail thermal tolerances, and without the drives it wouldn't matter who signed the checks. He tilted his head, studying her with the faint bewilderment of a man encountering an equation that refuses to balance. Most employees run from fire, he murmured. You seem predisposed to run through it. She wanted to reply that some lessons are written in coal dust and coffin brass, but the lift doors opened onto the lobby where paramedics swarmed, and words felt unnecessary. They were escorted to a triage zone in a side atrium whose floor-to-ceiling windows now reflected red emergency strobes against night-black glass. A medic peeled away her improvised mask, revealing lips cracked and bleeding. Oxygen hissed into a translucent cup she pressed gratefully to her face while cold saline dripped over minor burns on her wrists. Crane refused a stretcher but submitted to pulse oximetry, one sleeve slit to expose a blistered forearm. Even in disarray he radiated that peculiar stillness she had first noticed in the café, as if chaos merely provided a broader stage for his equilibrium. When the fire chief approached, helmet under one arm, to request a statement, Crane directed him to prioritize data integrity over structural salvage. The North Wing supercomputer cluster stored climate change models crucial for governmental policy advisories and must not be drenched. The chief bristled, citing firefighter safety, yet relented when Serafina produced a thermal contour map from her tablet demonstrating a firebreak route that would allow personnel access without crossing flashover thresholds. Procedure written on the fly became strategy, and within minutes firefighters redirected resources accordingly. Dawn crept over the Hudson as the last flames were declared contained. Journalists gathered beyond cordons, lenses glinting like carrion bird eyes, hungry for scandal or tragedy. Balthazar stood before them, clothes ruined, hair matted, and announced with unexpected candor that the incident was the result of a faulty capacitor array recently replaced under warranty. No casualties, data secure, operations to resume within 48 hours. He omitted any mention of Serafina's role, but when flashbulbs erupted he stepped sideways, creating a deliberate breach in his silhouette that framed her beside him, soot-smudged yet upright, slim shoulders squared against the photographic onslaught. Reporters seized the shot, billionaire and unknown engineer, firelit and formidable. Later, in the executive infirmary, he sat on the edge of an examination table while a nurse bandaged his arm. The drives lay on a stainless tray between them, like rescued treasure. Without looking up, he asked if she had ever considered that courage was a variable in orbital mechanics. She replied that if gravity is the curve that shapes destiny, maybe courage is the velocity that decides whether the curve becomes a horizon or a prison. He chuckled, winced as the gauze tightened, and said that horizons suited her far better than prisons. Before parting, he slipped a plastic access card into her palm, smaller than a movie ticket, embossed with his private seal. "The Ark's future now depends on someone who can outthink flame," he said. "This opens every secured lab on level 90. Use it tonight. The Design Council convenes at dawn tomorrow, and I intend them to hear your alloy solution from your own lips." She wanted to protest fatigue, wanted to collapse into sleep so heavy it erased sirens from memory, but the card's edges bit warmly into her skin, a tangible weight of entrusted authority. She nodded once, too weary for courtesy yet too wired for hesitation, and as she turned toward the elevator banks again she caught their reflections in the polished wall, two figures modeled by ash and emergency light bruises, standing not as employer and employee but as conspirators bound by heat and calculation, poised on a precipice from which the only sensible direction left was forward. Snowmelt still steamed off the tower's north facade when the media machinery found its rhythm, trading smoke for gossip with an appetite no sprinkler could quench. At 6 a.m. Serafina arrived in the executive glasshouse, a sunlit cafeteria that overlooked the city like an aviary, only to discover every table littered with copies of the Daily Pulse. The tabloid's front page showed a telephoto shot taken just moments after the server room blaze. Balthazar Crane stood in profile, shirt torn and arm bandaged, while beside him Serafina, hair singed at the tips, cheeks striped with ash, cradled the rescued data drives as though they were newborns. The headline blared in block capitals, "Coffee Girl Hero or Billionaire's New Obsession?" A subhead beneath twisted the knife further, "Barista turned scientist, climbs ranks after late-night rescue with CEO." By mid-paragraph the reporter, Callista Gable, was speculating about boardroom romance, suspiciously accelerated promotions, and whether Crane Nebula's vaunted safety protocols had been compromised by a reckless in-house liaison. The whispering that followed Serafina through the buffet line felt colder than the ice on her orange juice. Technicians she had worked beside all month offered stiff smiles then buried their faces in tablet screens. A follow-up article, already trending on Holonews, had dredged up public records proof of her Cumberland origins, framing her upbringing in a shuttered coal town as evidence of resourceful ambition bordering on opportunism. She counted 3 separate synonyms for gold digger before her appetite vanished entirely. When she slipped into the main lift the chatter inside cut off mid-syllable, a silence that throbbed louder than insult. 40 floors later she exited to find 2 junior accountants debating her surname's exact pronunciation, in the third person, while she was still within arm's reach. The younger one blushed, the elder offered a token nod, yet neither apologized. Quillen Park summoned her to Thermal Bay mezzanine under pretense of a routine alloy recalibration, but the hollowness beneath his measured greeting betrayed deeper concern. He produced a cardboard folder more suited to antique deeds than anything contemporary. Inside lay a stack of yellowing newspapers, each carefully sleeved. The top clipping dated back 6 years. Crane donates $40 million to Black Lung Survivors Trust. Another, 3 years later, secret benefactor pays off bankrupt Morganton Hospital wing. Beneath them, smaller headlines charted an unpublicized constellation of philanthropy, scholarship endowments for orphan miners' children, an anonymous fund to subsidize safety exoskeletons for injured laborers, seed grants for Appalachian broadband cooperatives. Across all, Crane's name appeared only in IRS filings and whispered footnotes. The mainstream coverage never connected the dots. Quillen's explanation was quiet, almost embarrassed, as though divulging a private defect. Balthazar, he said, believed public charity too often masked ego, better to target small infrastructures that kept unnoticed lives from collapsing. When Serafina traced a fingertip over the faded ink, she saw the outline of her own past tilt into a new perspective: the city library bookmobile that had rolled into Cumberland after the mine closure, the sudden upgrade to the high school's computer lab, the Coltipple respiratory clinic that treated her grandmother free of charge. She had assumed state grants or some benevolent NGO. Now suspicion bloomed that the funds had come from a man who never visited, never took credit, and certainly never expected a barista to break his secrecy. She found herself in the rooftop planetarium shortly after dusk, seeking solitude beneath the mechanical sky. The dome, normally reserved for corporate galas, was empty, the projection system looping a slow transit of Orion's belt that reminded her painfully of the coal dust drawings on her childhood roof. Beneath the artificial stars she finally allowed the day's humiliation to rip through her composure. She paced the circumference until frustration congealed into resolve, then opened a holopad and drafted a point-by-point rebuttal to Callista Gable's article, timestamps proving her hire preceded any interpersonal contact, anonymized performance reviews praising her contributions, evidence of board-approved budget signatures. Yet as she reread the draft she saw how defensive it sounded, how it ceded power by accepting the premise of scandal. She deleted every line, leaving only a single sentence: "The work speaks, everything else is noise." She stared at the words until they steadied her breathing, then closed the file unsent. Quillen entered unannounced, cane clicking on marble, carrying 2 steel travel mugs that steamed in the projector light. Without comment he handed her one, strong black tea, not coffee, and sat on the nearest bench, exoskeleton pistons sighing. He confessed he had once faced similar suspicion after refusing to hide his disability behind desk assignments. Rumor mills inevitably twisted merit into pity or leverage. The only antidote, he advised, was relentless excellence performed in public view. Results erase rumor faster than press releases, because narrative loves vacuum but fears hard data. He gestured upward as the projected constellations shifted into auroral ribbons across a midnight blue curvature. Crane is betting the arc can cool the ionosphere enough to make this real for children in Kentucky, he said. The journalist will look foolish when those kids post selfies under green sky. The image jolted Serafina, her father's impossible promise rendered suddenly tangible. She realized that every minute spent nursing hurt pride delayed the very miracle that would silence doubters. The following morning she strode into the Design Council auditorium wearing a pale lab coat still stained at the cuffs with alloy dust, refusing the polished blazer suggested by PR. Half the boardroom gazes flickered from her face to yesterday's headline displayed on tablets. She felt the scorch of their skepticism and let it fuel her. When her turn came she presented a revised thermal lattice simulation, live rendered in 40-foot holography, copper to palladium junctions breathing under cyclical load, helium vectors redirecting microbursts into recompression chambers, temperature variance collapsing by 14%. She concluded with a projection of launch mass savings great enough to add a second genetic archive per satellite. The slide deck ended, lights rose, and for 3 seconds the boardroom was silent except for the faint whir of projectors cooling. Then the chief financial officer, a man whose tenure outlived most mergers, asked whether such savings were auditable in the eyes of shareholders. Serafina answered not with more slides but by retrieving from her bag a palm-sized ingot. The new alloy sputtered overnight into a test coupon. She tossed it across the table, it rang like a tuning fork and came to rest before the CFO's calculator. "That's what 14% sounds like," she said. Quillen, seated near the exit, coughed to hide a laugh as several directors applauded despite themselves. By lunchtime her projection was circulating through the engineering Slack channels, overshadowing the tabloid trope with an avalanche of GIFs depicting exploding copper crystals versus resilient palladium meshes. Someone photoshopped the Daily Pulse headline to read "Coffee Girl Melts Share Price," and the meme rocketed across internal message boards faster than HR could object. Balthazar Crane, ever enigmatic, sent her only a 6-word encrypted text: "Feed the work, starve the noise." That evening, however, a courier delivered to her apartment a cylindrical case of mahogany containing a single slide rule from the 1960s, its ivory faces etched with celestial mechanics functions. A note in Crane's angular script read, "For drawing skylines on rooftops." She ran her thumb along the worn bevel, thinking of her father and the coal dust constellations, and understood the gift as allyship rather than reward. Callista Gable's article stayed in rotation for another 48 hours, then slipped beneath newer scandals, a cryptocurrency exchange collapse, a celebrity divorce. Online sentiment toward Serafina inverted when a junior analyst leaked footage of her alloy deposition marathon, the camera capturing blisters forming on her gloved wrists as she guided the sputter arm, voice steady despite exhaustion. Comment threads filled with arguments about labor ethic, about women in STEM, about the gulf between gossip and grit. By weekend's end the hashtag Arc of Wild had trended for 6 hours, long enough for late-night hosts to riff on it before moving to the next punchline. Serafina spent that weekend in the sub-basement cleanroom, triple-checking gasket tolerances on Prototype Zero's newly plated plumbing. Only once did she pause. Above the whine of vacuum pumps she thought she heard the distant rumble of a coal car conveyor, the echo of a childhood mine long buried. She lifted her gaze to the fluorescent panels, imagining the planetarium dome beyond the concrete floors and the real aurora that might one day ripple across Appalachian skies. The gossip would return, she knew, narratives were resilient parasites. But for the first time since the tabloid broke she felt inoculated, less by Quillen's counsel or Crane's hidden benevolence, and more by the certainty that the work, once illuminated, could outshine even the brightest flare of rumor. Somewhere in the future a child would stand on a rickety roof and see green fire swirl overhead, proof that coal dust could birth starlight, and that would be the only headline worth chasing. For a brief stretch of winter the tower settled into productive rhythm, the prototypes easing through vacuum chamber trials like well-tuned cellos, and Serafina allowed herself to imagine the rest of the schedule unfolding without fresh catastrophe. That illusion cracked the evening her access card flagged a procurement order she had never approved, a batch of hardened radiation shields rated for neutron flux far beyond what low Earth orbit laboratories required. She sat alone in Bay 9, fluorescent lights humming, and scrolled through line items that read less like scientific instrumentation and more like the beginnings of tactical hardware, hyper-encrypted telemetry crates, thermal imaging chips with battlefield certifications, a modified gyroscope package designed for sub-meter ground targeting. Each had been greenlit by Lysander Flint, Crane Nebula's vice CEO, whose digital signature gleamed in legal gold beside the words, expedited for strategic partnership. Flint had always struck her as polished marble over a fault line, eloquent, manicured, and unnervingly opaque. His resume sparkled with Ivy League gloss and a fast-track DARPA fellowship, yet rumor claimed he kept 2 cell phones, one for corporate business, one for calls that never showed on billing statements. She found him that night in the executive lounge, a leather-walled area suspended inside the skyscraper's crowning glass prism, where city lights swam like bioluminescent plankton beneath his shoes. He welcomed her with a smile narrow enough to slip between atomic lattices and gestured to a decanter of scotch so old it had forgotten which century it belonged to. She declined the drink and slid a hologram of the procurement docket across the low table. Flint's eyes flicked over the figures with the detached curiosity of a man reading stock quotes unrelated to his own fortune. When he finally spoke his voice carried the warmth of velvet wrapped round a scalpel. He congratulated her on the palladium lattice, a masterstroke of elegant pragmatism, he said, but insisted that true viability for Aurora Arc lay in diversified revenue streams. Governments, especially those vying for orbital superiority, would pay exponentially more than NGOs to rent a constellation capable of near real-time spectrographic surveillance. He described humanitarian spin, tracking methane leaks over war zones, flagging chemical weapon precursors before armies deployed them. His monologue glided from altruism to inevitability, painting militarization as righteous evolution, and when he paused it was to offer her a seat on a newly formed strategic applications board, salary tripled, stock options shielded behind shell LLCs that would never appear in public filings. Serafina felt the room tilt, though the building's seismic dampers held perfectly level. She heard her father's coal dust vow about keeping eyes on safe sky, heard Quillen's quiet faith that excellence needed no hidden motive, and replied that Aurora Arc was built to protect the fragile archive of life, not police it. Flint's smile did not waver, but a chill threaded his words as he assured her paradigms shifted whether designers approved or not, the question was whether she wanted influence or obsolescence. She left without answering, palms damp despite the lounge's cool air, and rode the elevator down 50 floors while composing a mental inventory of allies she could still trust. First was Quillen. In the machine shop he listened without interruption as she laid out the suspicious orders. He riffled through the invoices, jaw locking tighter at each signature, and pronounced the situation, rot disguised as perfumery. Together they summoned Zephyrin Brooks, Crane's in-house counsel rumored to bleed clauses instead of blood. Brooks arrived carrying a briefcase plastered with faded activist stickers, silence equals death, outlaw war profiteers, and within minutes transformed Serafina's hunch into a legal grid of procurement codes, export control statutes, and non-proliferation treaties. If Flint's shipments crossed an ocean, Brooks said, the company would pivot from aerospace darling to international pariah in a single news cycle. They needed proof powerful enough to convince the board before Flint's shadow contract solidified. Serafina proposed diving into the satellite firmware. Every ARC unit carried redundant microcode uploaded through a secure quantum channel. If Flint planned dual-use functionality, the hooks would be buried there. Quillen requisitioned a cleanroom bench at 2 a.m., and for 3 nights the trio mapped code strings while the city slept. Somewhere past dawn on the 4th day Serafina isolated a dormant routine labeled HY vector. On activation it rerouted spectrometer arrays to scan atmospheric plumes for ammonia derivatives, common markers of nerve agents, and adjusted orbital altitude for prolonged loiter over geo-fenced coordinates. Legitimate science might justify such capability, but Brooks unearthed emails showing Flint courting defense contract bidders with precisely those metrics. Intent, motive, mechanism, the trifecta of damning evidence. Balthazar Crane was away in Geneva courting climate science partners, unreachable for 72 hours. That left the board of directors, a phalanx of individuals who loved risk only when it wore cologne and carried insurance. An emergency session convened in Auditorium Delta, an amphitheater of glass tiers and LED dais arced like a crescent moon. Flint opened with a slideshow heavy on battlefield disaster footage, children under gas mask hoods, drones sampling toxic clouds, claiming Aurora Arc could end such horrors by providing early warning overlays to Allied forces. Several directors leaned forward, already tasting Nobel Prizes mixed with defense appropriations. Serafina, seated with Quillen and Brooks behind a slim console, waited until Flint projected revenue estimates. She requested the floor, her voice steady despite throat muscles vibrating like taut wire. On the curved wall behind her she launched a live emulation of HY vector. Simulated satellites snapped from their peaceful polar survey paths and settled into racetrack orbits over the Persian Gulf, spectral lines for Sarin and VX highlighted in angry crimsons. A secondary readout displayed coordinates auto-transmitting to a fictitious, joint tactical cloud. The room fell silent except for the soft whine of projectors shifting hues. She explained that with a few keystrokes the Ark could become the ultimate reconnaissance lattice, its public mission an elegant veil. She did not moralize, she traced liability. If even one missile strike followed Arc Intel, Crane Nebula would face warcrime investigations and shareholder value would crater deeper than any mine shaft. Flint laughed, crisp and condescending, and called her demonstration melodrama. He accused her of sabotaging code to fabricate risk, suggested her recent tabloid notoriety made her thirsty for stage lights. Before he could build momentum Brooks stepped in, brandishing printed copies of the procurement chain, each page notarized, each signature Flint's. The lawyer identified specific ITAR clauses that Flint's pending shipments already violated and cited penalties ranging from multi-million-dollar fines to federal prison. Directors began murmuring, eyes darting to the exits as though subpoenas waited outside. Yet the vote was not a foregone conclusion. Flint held proxy shares, and 2 major investors dialed in from London, voices tinny yet influential, urging delay for further analysis. Serafina felt victory sliding sideways until Quillen rose, unsupported by his exoskeleton's cane for once, and recounted the night the prototype's copper veins had almost killed the Arkansas. He described Serafina crawling under a half-frozen hull to patch fractures with hands already blistering, argued that any strategy discounting her integrity was mathematically suspect because the Ark itself owed its heartbeat to that integrity. His speech, raw and unscripted, carried the ring of hydraulic presses clamping steel, unyielding, industrial truth. The chairman called the vote. 6 hands lifted to suspend Flint pending investigation, 3 opposed. Flint's smile at last cracked, revealing an edge as jagged as sawtooth uranium glass. Security escorted him to collect personal items, though he walked with theatrical calm, promising in low tones that innovators often found themselves crucified by the timid before history rewrote them as visionaries. His parting glance at Serafina held no rage, only a predator's calculus. She met it with level eyes, reminding herself of coal dust under winter stars, of a promise to keep the sky safe. After the boardroom cleared, Brooks secured the firmware repository with a quantum checksum that could not be altered without tripping alarms across global mirrors. Quillen shut down every supplier portal tied to Flint's credentials. Serafina, alone for the first time all day, sat in a quiet corner overlooking the river, exhaustion folding over her like lead blankets. She wondered if victory tasted bitter by nature or if the hint of ash on her tongue was psychosomatic memory of the server room blaze. Her private comm vibrated, a message from Balthazar Crane time-stamped 7 minutes earlier, short enough to memorize in one glance. Saw the vote, proud of the trajectory, wheels down in 12 hours, keep horizon clear. She closed the screen and let the city's reflection ripple across the windowpane, thinking of trajectories, of vectors that could carry hope or ruin depending on who plotted them. Aurora Arc still lay cradle-bound in the hangar, but tonight its future felt marginally safer, wrested back from weaponized ambition by a coalition of scarred pragmatists and one Coaltown dreamer who refused to trade Auroras for crosshairs. Even at 30,000 feet the corporate jet could not outrun the February crosswinds that battered its wings like mallets on a cathedral drum, but Balthazar Crane paced the aisle with the unhurried grace of a man strolling a museum, rereading the board. Vote transcript that Zephyrin Brooks had encrypted to his private channel. By the time the plane touched down at Teterboro long past midnight, he had annotated every margin in stylish sharp capitals, questions about revenue risk, notes on export control loopholes Flint had tried to exploit, one underlined phrase that simply read, wild equals constant, protect variable. When the car slid him through Lincoln Tunnel toward Manhattan he kept the window cracked despite the cold. The smell of the Hudson at night reminded him, for reasons he could never articulate, of solder flux and possibility. Serafina, meanwhile, stood on the roof of Crane Nebula's tower under a sky so clear it seemed vacuum-sealed. The maintenance crew had finished installing her latest indulgence, a ring of Tesla coils hidden along the helipad perimeter, their discharge columns tuned to ionize trace gases in the air and paint ephemeral curtains of green and violet. It was no substitute for a true aurora, but the physics was close enough to coax photons into dance, and tonight she needed the rehearsal to work flawlessly. She cued the diagnostic sequence, the coils hummed, Arc stitched a slow sinusoid, and for 30 heartbeats the city acquired a soft polar crown that shimmered above office blocks like the ghost of an Arctic dawn. Wind snatched vapor and smeared the colors into ribbons. She killed the power, satisfied the effect could scale, then descended to brief the electricians, her boots ringing down the steel ladder like a xylophone struck out of order. At noon the next day, the first time zones in Eurasia were already reading articles about Flint's suspension, and investor sentiment graphs bounced between panic and relief like seismographs on an unstable fault. Serafina buried herself in subsystem integration, pretending not to check headlines every half hour. When the messenger from executive services arrived with a crisp envelope she almost waved him away, convinced it housed another legal query, but the interior card contained a single sentence in Balthazar's angular hand, 2000 hours, rooftop, formal attire optional, honesty required. Her pulse stuttered. Honesty was easy in engineering specs, far harder when the subject was half-articulated gravity between two people. Twilight soaked the city in blue ink as she changed in the women's locker, trading her grease-smudged jumpsuit for black slacks, a near-white cashmere turtleneck, and the thin meteorite pendant Quillen had machined from scrap alloy and given her as a cynical Valentine's joke. She left the lab coat because the smell of liquid helium still clung to its fibers, a scent she suspected Balthazar associated with crisis rather than comfort. The service elevator whisked her upward in a hush so complete she heard her own blood traveling the loops of her ears. When the doors parted onto the windswept roof, she saw him beside a tall tripod that supported a box no larger than a suitcase yet bristling with optics. His charcoal overcoat flapped in gusts, silk lining catching stray light from the flight beacon halos, and although a healing burn still inked raw coral above his cuff, he stood without sling or complaint, both hands resting atop the tripod as if it were a lectern. He spoke first, voice low enough that she advanced 3 steps just to borrow its warmth. He thanked her for steering the Ark clear of weaponized orbit. He admitted he had underestimated Flint's ambition. He gave her, in plain terms rare for him, permission to veto any future procurement that smelled of anything harsher than science. She nodded, remembering Brooks's talk of liability, but pressed for deeper confession. Why, she asked, had he ever entertained Flint's dual-use overtures at all? He answered not with corporate jargon but with a personal story. At 17 he had watched his mother, an atmospheric chemist, field death threats for publishing data on classified nerve agent dispersals. She taught him that darkness coveted bright tools, so if you wanted certain instruments to exist you had to surround them with brighter purpose than any warlord could stomach. Flint, he admitted, had begun as a necessary devil, someone who could navigate the defense world long enough for Crane Nebula's peaceful tech to gain fiscal immunity, yet devils grow accustomed to flame and forget the burn of daylight. The wind hardened, slapping Serafina's curls against her cheek, but instead of drawing tighter around herself she stepped beside him to study the tripod payload. It was a miniature laser spectrograph linked to the roof's Tesla network. Tonight, he said, they would test whether a scaled version could paint sustainable auroras 10 miles over Appalachia. She felt a lump form behind her sternum. The Coal Town dream was about to take its first micro-breath. Balthazar handed her a control wafer the size of a candy bar, its surface alive with iridescent icons. When she hesitated he murmured that courage had never been her deficit. She pressed the ignition glyph, a tremor ran through the tripod, coils below ramped from dormant to singing, and a filament of lime-green light rose into the night like watercolor pulled across wet paper. Within seconds the sky unfurled a wavering banner that dwarfed her earlier rehearsal, a living drape of jade and amethyst that fluttered against the firmament, reflecting off the East River in broken shards of color. Below, traffic paused, pedestrians tilted phones upward, a child's whoop reached them from somewhere near Bryant Park. Newsroom scanners erupted. Drones with press logos ascended from neighboring rooftops, red tally lights blinking. Crane's security detail, posted discreetly at stairwells, made no move to shoo them. Tonight's spectacle was meant for lenses as much as for retinas. Balthazar turned to her, illumination from the false aurora staining half his face emerald. He asked permission before offering a toast from a thermos hidden in a flight case, pouring steaming chicory coffee into enamel cups more at home on a campsite than a helipad. The taste spun her backward through years to that coal dust roof and her father sketching stars. Moisture pricked behind her eyes, and when she set the cup down her knuckles brushed his. Static jumped skin to skin, a jolt sharper than in the cafe that first night, and she realized her heart was hammering audible beats around them. He spoke her name once, neither question nor statement, and she replied with his. In the expanding hush words shed their scaffolding until only content remained. She told him fear still visited her between 3 and 4 a.m., whispering that every gain could melt if one alloy cracked. He admitted he, too, woke to doubts, that his company's ascent outpaced the moral calculus of every choice, that someday the lattice of promises might sag under unpredicted weight. She laughed softly at the symmetry, then sobered, saying symmetry suggested solution space. The moment hung, balanced on the edge of physics and feeling, until a camera drone drifted too near, its rotors chopping the air 5 meters away. Without shifting stance Balthazar extended a small remote from his coat pocket, a pulse of RF scrambled the drone's guidance and coaxed it to a polite altitude. Reporters, realizing their toy had been allowed rather than warded off, focused their gimbals and shot rapidly. The resulting photographs, printed worldwide by morning, would show a titan of industry and a soot-scar scientist standing shoulder to shoulder beneath an aurora they themselves had conjured, a tableau so simultaneous with myth and modernity it required no headline. Yet the night's most pivotal scene escaped lenses entirely. After the spectacle dimmed and generators spooled down, after security shepherded media to elevators with complimentary press packets outlining the ARC's purely humanitarian objective, Balthazar led Serafina to the tiny greenhouse annex at the roof's southeast quadrant. Inside, heaters hummed, nurturing dwarf spruce seedlings grown from seed banks of threatened boreal forests, future passengers for the ARC's orbital cryopods. He knelt with difficulty, still favoring the burn across his shoulder, to unhook a seedling from its rack. Its needles glowed silver in the grow lights. He pressed the pot into her hands, soil still warm from biosubstrate coils, and said that long before rockets or balance sheets, civilizations proved their covenant with tomorrow by planting trees they might never sit beneath. The ARC, he proposed, was such a tree. She, the caretaker who ensured roots found hold in frozen dark. His words trembled, not from cold. Without hesitation she reached, touched the burn scar that peeked from his cuff, and told him caretakers worked best in pairs because some storms required 4 hands on the trunk. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaled, and in that breath an unspoken contract formed, something quieter than romance yet denser than ordinary trust, a vow to shoulder wherever trajectory bent. They returned to the service elevator well after midnight, aurora residue still echoing as thin green swaths across the upper troposphere. On sublevels the integration crews toiled, unaware the skyline had worn artificial crowns. At her lab door he paused, asked if she needed anything before morning. She answered only that she needed him to keep scheduling honesty, not meetings, because honesty accomplished more work. He smiled, a real, unsymmetrical curve that made him look startlingly young, then inclined his head as though sealing a treaty. She spent what remained of the night inside Prototype 0, calibrating microthruster valves that would one day orient living libraries against cosmic ray barrage, but every metallic ping seemed to echo the rooftop pulse of synthesized aurora. At 5:17 a.m., hunger finally reminded her of her body. She headed for the vending alcove and found a surprise on the counter, an insulated lunchbox bearing her initials in laser etch, inside a perfectly packed Appalachian breakfast, cornmeal biscuits, sorghum butter, and a jar of blackberry preserves sourced nowhere near city lines. No note accompanied the gift, none was necessary. She ate in slow, grateful increments, tasting childhood and tomorrow interlaced. Dawn arrived shy, pastel, embarrassed perhaps to follow neon auroras. She looked out the eastern windows toward skies now plain and felt the Earth's rotation as a physical tug. Below, the feed from overnight media crawled across wall monitors, commentary gushing about sustainable sky art, about scientists who weaponized wonder rather than warfare, about a billionaire who seemed intent on delivering spectacles no one had thought to dream. The pundits debated whether the display signaled marketing genius or philanthropic showmanship, but Serafina understood what the pictures concealed: a seedling exchanged in greenhouse light, a cup of chicory shielding shared fragilities, an engineer and an executive discovering that trust, like auroras, began with collision, charged particles meeting atmosphere, and only then bloomed into radiance. Long before the building stirred fully awake, she opened a secure comm channel and transmitted new thruster parameters to the simulation cluster, annotating them with the note, trajectory adjusted for dual caretakers. It was the most technical love letter she could manage, angles and impulses masquerading as sentiment, but she suspected he would decode the subtext. Outside, a solitary green wisp lingered at the edge of dawn, the last echo of their artificial heaven, and she whispered to it that soon the real Arctic curtain would bow over Kentucky coal towns. Tonight's trial had proven the principle, the next tests would scale it to orbit. After that, children on forgotten rooftops would inherit the sky her father once promised. She touched the meteorite pendant at her throat, a fragment of wanderer captured by gravity, and wondered, with a smile both tender and fierce, what new constellations she and Balthazar might chart if they dared keep colliding in precisely the right direction. 5 nights after the rooftop aurora, when headlines had mellowed into think pieces and the board devoted itself to mundane funding dockets again, Serafina stayed late in the sub-basement cleanroom finalizing a just-approved firmware patch. The polished steel clock above the isolation vestibule read 2:37, the only other living presence was a sleepy janitor mopping in desultory circles near the freight lift. She finished her validation run, signed the cryptographic hash, and walked the corridor toward the staff dormitory, rolling stiffness from her shoulders while replaying Balthazar's last message, 3 words typed during a Zurich layover, "Miss orbiting you." She nearly smiled, but the elevator doors opened instead of closing, and 2 men wearing Blue Label courier jackets stepped out with a polycarbonate carry case. She expected them to head for the shipping bay, instead they pivoted, blocking her path. Sleeplessness dulled her reaction, yet something in their posture, knees bent, hands loose, screamed wrong frequency. She began to ask which department had cleared after-hours access, but a third figure emerged behind her, pressing a damp cloth over her mouth. The odor of chloroform was faint. She recognized it from first-year organic chem but still inhaled enough to fuzz her vision. Awareness shrank to a tunnel framed by overhead fluorescence receding into blur. Moments later she felt herself bundled into the elevator, the world tilting sideways as if she were no longer subject to the same axis as the building. She resurfaced amid frigid air that smelled of rust, limestone, and the stale breath of disused subway tunnels. Cables bit her wrists, her ankles were zip-tied to a folding chair bolted to a small trolley. Headlamps cut hazy tunnels through dust motes, illuminating walls slick with mineral seep. A rumble somewhere overhead suggested late-night trains, but echoes twisted direction until she could not say which lines or how deep. Her captors, 5 in total, 2 women and 3 men, had traded courier garb for charcoal tactical jumpsuits marked with a stylized bourbon glass, the sigil of a notorious urban exploration crew called Bourbon Hour, famous for live-streaming illegal descents into abandoned infrastructure. She recalled a half-remembered podcast. The group took corporate sabotage gigs when adventure donations ran thin. Which meant Flint was moving from corporate maneuvers to physical coercion. The leader, a rangy woman with silver septum ring and a soothing Tennessee lilt, introduced herself as Marlowe. She complimented Serafina's gravity-defying PR, then explained tonight's itinerary. They would hold her long enough for Flint's lawyers to file an injunction freezing Aurora Arc until courts could unspool competing patent claims. If she cooperated, by recording a deposition stating the Arc was not launch-ready, she'd be returned topside before dawn with no more than bruises and a dramatic anecdote. Should she refuse, Marlowe gestured to the carry case, now open, revealing thermite charges shaped like hockey pucks and a handheld cryo cylinder. Thermite would erase key node servers, liquid nitrogen could shatter the prototype's untested thruster assemblies, either outcome ended the Arc as cleanly as any lawsuit. Her consent, Marlowe cooed, determined whether sabotage occurred. Serafina tasted iron where she bit the inside of her cheek. Signing false testimony would guarantee delays long enough for Flint's defense bidders to regroup. Staying silent risked the Arc and thousands of frozen genomes. She requested water, buying seconds to reboot analytical mindset. While Marlowe poured from a dented flask, Serafina catalogued surroundings. Cave-cut granite blocks indicated an early 1900s rail spur, narrow-gauge tracks glinted beneath sediment, chill drafts suggested proximity to one of Manhattan's buried river outlets. She recalled studying urban hydrology maps during childhood. Cumberland's miners revered groundwater flows, and in graduate school she had annotated New York subterranean streams for a side project on thermal dissipation. If Bourbon Hour had chosen a supposed dead-end tunnel, they were ignorant of the old Croton Aqueduct bypass running parallel 90 feet east. That bypass included an emergency airshaft capped with a rusted grate leading to a maintenance alley near the Hudson. Her wrists flexed against zip ties, cheap plastic, brittle in cold. She began scrubbing them back and forth along the chair's serrated edge while feigning fatigue. Marlowe filmed the first testimony clip on a chest-mounted camera, instructing Serafina to state name and role. Serafina complied, voice shaking theatrically, but when prompted to confirm the Arc's latent design faults, she angled her chin, letting overhead lamp glare white out the camera lens, and instead recited the thermodynamic constant for palladium's phase transition at 3 Kelvin. Confused, Marlowe cursed and stopped recording. While the crew conferred, Serafina's wrist tie frayed, a final tug snapped the plastic. She kicked backward, toppling the trolley to kill her silhouette under lamps, and sprinted into adjacent darkness with ankles still bound but adrenaline propelling her in bounding hops. Bourbon Hour shouted, flashlights scattering, but she ducked a spur track and followed the downdraft smell of river silt, counting crossbeams, 22, 21, until memory whispered that the air shaft should lie at beam 14. Gunmetal footsteps closed behind. She reached the shaft, a vertical pipe 4 feet in diameter, grillwork corroded. She battered the grate with her bound feet, rust flakes snowed. Grate gave way on the third kick. She wedged herself into the pipe, using elbows and knees to climb chimney style. Upward, darkness pinwheeled. Below, Marlowe cursed, sparks fizzed as someone fired a taser up the shaft, its prongs ricocheting off iron. 40 feet ascended felt like 400, cold bit flesh through slacks. Suddenly the pipe dog-legged into brick, she reached a maintenance hatch sealed by age. Her multi-tool rested back in the lab, but her wristwatch face provided tempered glass. She smashed it, driving the shard into corroded putty, levering until the panel shrieked open. Icy night air poured in, smelling of diesel and tidal mud. She crawled, fingers numb, and rolled onto cracked asphalt behind a stack of shipping pallets at a riverside service road. Blue strobes winked blocks away, NYPD cruisers at a routine traffic stop. She hobbled toward them, hands raised, vocal cords raw from breathing dust. The first officer's startled expression melted into radiobark efficiency as she dropped Flint's name, sabotage, kidnapping, and weapons-grade thermite in tumbling order. Within minutes half Midtown's precinct converged. Bourbon Hour's escape route funneled them onto flooded service tracks where they were cornered, thermite charges intact. Marlowe was dragged out last, wrist chained, smirk gone granite. Dawn bled over the river by the time Serafina sat in a medic's blanket outside the tower, shoes and pride shredded but spine unbowed. Quillen arrived on a borrowed motorcycle, engine still ticking, and without comment clipped the remains of zip ties from her ankles while paramedics swabbed cuts. Zephyrin Brooks handled police questions, citing kidnapping statutes and corporate espionage paragraphs too fast for reporters to parse. Balthazar landed via rooftop helipad moments later, having diverted mid-flight when security pinged his sat phone. He descended the freight elevator at a run, reached her side, and knelt despite protocol, ignoring cameras snapping like locusts. She expected an embrace, instead he offered his wrist, pulse thrumming beneath skin, as if to say take anchor first, tenderness second. She clasped it, grounding. In the executive command room hours later, they faced a sea of board members whose expressions ranged from mortified to murderous. Brooks outlined how Flint, though suspended, had funneled hush funds through a Cayman subsidiary to hire Bourbon Hour. Digital forensics retrieved emails proving intent to coerce false testimony. The board voted unanimously to terminate Flint for cause, releasing a statement condemning violence against employees. Civil authorities pursued attempted kidnapping and terrorism charges. The DOJ added export control conspiracy counts. Serafina spoke only once, a single sentence reminding them that technical integrity was not bulletproof glass but it could still stop bullets when everyone held the line. Silence followed like benediction. That evening, alone in the lab, she pried open the polycarbonate case recovered from Marlowe. Nestled beside the dormant thermite sat her missing meteorite pendant. She had not realized it was gone. A note on Bourbon Hour letterhead lay underneath, even pirates respect certain stars. Keep searching the dark. The gesture, half threat half compliment, unsettled her more than the kidnapping. She gingerly placed the pendant back around her neck, vowing its orbit would never again depend on strangers' whims. 3 days later security contractors sealed every subterranean access point within a 2-mile radius of the tower, welding plates and installing biometric locks keyed to staff who actually existed. Serafina lobbied to reroute a fraction of those funds toward a grant for urban geology students documenting forgotten watercourses. The board approved, PR savvy sharpening after recent debacles. She visited the tunnel where she'd escaped, now a concrete plug with sensor mesh, and chalked Orion's beloved constellation Cygnus on the barrier before the final panel slid into place. On her next rooftop rendezvous with Balthazar, the Aurora generators remained silent, instead they watched real stars flicker, paler than neon but infinitely older. He said nothing about the kidnapping, as though speaking might feed the nightmare. Instead he produced a rolled blueprint, an updated ARC payload manifest, with an extra module labeled Wild Nodes, Microlabs dedicated to in-orbit mineralogy. She traced the circuitry initials, realizing he had turned her escape's geology into science directive. He looked almost shy, asking if she approved. She replied by interlacing their fingers, the simplest signature she could give, and overhead a satellite in polar traverse winked sun-off solar wings, reminder that even trapped trajectories bend to new vectors when spirited hands push against gravity.